Kia ora team, Chris Farhi here. So this vlog will be looking at the biggest news in New Zealand real estate during the month of March. So let's get into it. Probably the biggest news this month was that the government announced a suite of new policies to help to solve the housing crisis. And so the policies are split into demand and supply measures. On the supply side, the government announced a couple of different measures around improving the supply of housing, giving Kainga Ora a $2 billion loan to allow them to acquire more land, and then a boost to the Apprenticeship Boost scheme. So those were the supply measures, but the demand measures are actually a little bit more interesting. So in the lead up to the announcements, there was quite a bit of banter around the market about how the government was likely to extend the bright line test from 5 years to 10 years. And so there's a lot of comments about that, but people were saying that, we don't really think the government will actually do anything really meaningful. And so it was quite interesting when they actually made the announcements. So as expected, the government did extend the bright line test. So it's gone from 5 years to 10 years. So what that means is that if you've got a rental home and you sell it within a 10-year period, if you've made a capital gain at the time of sale, then you basically pay tax on that. There are some exclusions, like for example, for new builds, it's been kept at 5 years. And then obviously excludes your main residence. Something that was a bit of a surprise though was that in addition to extending the bright line test, the government also removed interest deductibility for rental homes. And so this was pretty interesting because when I was watching the live announcement, they sort of talked about the bright line test. I was like, okay, cool, that's pretty much what was expected. And then they started to talk about the removal of interest deductibility. I was like, oh, that's very interesting. So what this one means is that if you've got a rental home that has a mortgage on it, previously the interest expense for the mortgage you could basically deduct out of the taxable income. So you get like a bit of a tax credit for that. And so what the government's done is they've basically said, from 4 years from now for existing investors, we're going to remove that ability to deduct the interest expense. And so instead of having a tax credit, you basically won't get that tax credit for that component of the costs. And so this has upset a lot of property investors. Straight after the announcement, basically a series of the property investor interest groups were saying how it was basically discrimination, that it would result in rents going up as investors tried to recuperate what was previously a tax credit and so forth. I guess, the balanced view on that is that it probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise because in terms of the measures that the government had, they probably had one which was to restrict investors, so maybe similar to what they did with the foreign buyer ban of just blocking certain parties from purchasing in the market, and then otherwise they had to financially disincentivize property investment, and so they've obviously chosen to go that path. Shortly after the announcements, a bunch of the economists started to speculate about what the impact would be, and to be honest, I don't think anyone really knows in terms of any accurate assessment of it. And one of the reasons for that is that house prices have got so high that it's pretty hard to then make any fundamental financial analysis on the impact. But there's different arguments around prices going down, going sideways. Some people saying they might even go up as people withdraw their properties from the market. So it's all real speculation at the moment. And I think we'll just have to wait and see over the coming months. On balance though, you'd have to pick that there'd be some sort of negative impact generally on the market, whether that means prices go down or they just sort of slow in terms of increases. But that's specifically because you've got a large group of potential buyers in the market that have now had this negative influence put on them. So yeah, I guess we'll wait and see. The other curious element will be what happens in May or June. So during the announcements around these policies, the Minister of Finance flagged that they're also getting some advice from the Reserve Bank, which I presume relates to the debt to income ratios and or the restriction on interest-only loans to investors. So I guess it's quite possible that this salvo of stuff that's happened in March might be followed up by another drop in May or June as they add further restrictions. So in other news, changes around the laws for unit titles have passed their first reading in Parliament. So these are proposed changes to the laws around high-density housing, so apartments. And looking at the notes, so it's around improving information disclosure for prospective buyers, strengthening governance, increasing professionalism of body corporate managers, and ensuring that long-term maintenance projects are adequately planned. So a lot of you will know that I'm pretty passionate about apartment living, and I think living in nice apartments is really good, probably not so much for shit apartments. But definitely when you're looking to buy apartments, the two issues that I've definitely seen is poor information disclosure in body corporate minutes, and then just what looks to be poor long-term planning around maintenance. So to give you, sort of two examples, one would be when you look at the body corporate minutes, quite often comments about certain things, particularly defects or where work's likely to be needed, are quite often heavily cleansed, and they'll just make these very basic comments like, body corporate's currently just checking the roof or something like that. But then you get the inside story and then you realize that there's like massive issues with the roof. So that would be one example. And then the other would be when it comes to long-term maintenance planning, when you look at the line items in the budgets, quite often they'll have really like at face value low amounts, like 50 grand for like what could be quite a valuable building. And just at face value, it just seems like that's completely undercooked. And you wonder if either they've got really poor quality advice supporting that budgeting, or that they've budgeted the 10-year period, but they've assumed that all the expensive stuff kind of happens at year 11, 12, 13, 14. So yeah, I think these changes that they're proposing make heaps of sense. So moving into projects, the big announcement this month was Auckland Council and its subsidiary Panuku announcing that they'd entered into a deal with the Malaysian Resources Corporation Board to develop a $452 million mixed-use scheme above Aotea Station in central Auckland. So this project's utilising the air rights above Aotea Station in central Auckland, and more specifically above the old Bledisloe car park. And so this site was actually a site that freed up through Auckland Council's corporate property strategy, which they've been implementing over the past few years to help to reduce their footprint, achieve cost savings, and improve sustainability. And so as part of that, they've freed up the site, which they've then sold a long-term lease to the Malaysian Resources Corporation Board to undertake this development. And so basically what this means is that the Malaysian Resources Corporation Board will have a lease for 125 years where they can develop the site, and at the end of that, the site will come back to Auckland Council. The development itself is massive, so it's about 21 stories. It's got 15,000 square meters of office space and 20,000 square meters of residential space. So it'd be really cool to see that one go up. It'll be a couple of years though before we see any action, because the City Rail Link has the site until 2024, so you won't actually see any construction of the new building until around that time. Moving down to the waterfront, so Precinct Properties announced renewed plans for 1 Queen Street. So this is the old HSBC building at the front of Commercial Bay, and Precinct Properties has been planning to redevelop that as part of that wider scheme. So the latest announcement is that they've basically tweaked the mix of uses within their scheme. So I'll just check my notes. So it's got a smaller 139 room hotel, 3 levels of shared workspace, 2 levels of private offices, 7 levels of premium grade office space, and a rooftop bar. And so the key change that they've made there is that they've reduced the quantum of hotel rooms, which obviously makes sense given the limited number of tourists at the moment. So they've also indicated that they'll be making further decisions in the next 6 months, presumably about whether to proceed, and I assume that that's associated with securing tenants for the building. So next up, out near Auckland Airport, Foodstuffs has opened their brand new headquarters and distribution centre. This is exciting for 2 reasons. One, the building looks really cool, and B, it's humongous. So it's about 77,000 square meters, of which most of that's the distribution centre. It's got a capacity of about 80,000 pallets, which sounds like heaps of pallets. So that's really cool. Now this one's interesting. They announced in 2018 that they were moving, so that they were going to sell their Roma Road old site and then move out to a new site at the airport. They sold that site to Goodman with like a 2 or 3 year lease back, so they could actually get the new building completed. Now, coincidentally, this month, Goodman also announced that they'd secured an anchor tenant for the redevelopment of Roma Road, which is the old Foodstuffs site. And so they announced that NZ Post is taking like a, 17,700 square meter design build at that site. So yeah, real exciting and quite cool to see, I guess, a new site come into play at the airport, and then the old site also being redeveloped. So yep, super cool. Finally, didn't want to leave out the South Island. So down in Christchurch, a pretty cool project was announced this month with Marian College announcing that they're developing a school within an old warehouse building. And so coincidentally, they're actually taking an old Foodstuffs distribution centre and they're building a school within it. And so in terms of the specs, there's 26 classrooms, a chapel, sports hall, and a bunch of other cool stuff. and they're actually developing it within like the roof line of the existing warehouse. And so the announcements about it talked about sustainability and that sort of thing. I assume there's probably also a cost play, because by doing this, the school development becomes more of like a fit out rather than like a full-on base build. So yeah, like the pictures look really cool, and I reckon that's a really interesting use for an old building, and I guess opens up their ability to a wider range of potential sites rather than just trying to target land. So yeah, super cool. So around the same time as that announcement, they also put their old site on the market for sale, and so that's around an 18,000 square metre residential suburban zone site in Christchurch, which they're selling in parallel to this development. So look, hopefully you enjoyed this little update of the biggest real estate news from around New Zealand during March. If you like this sort of thing, then definitely jump on LinkedIn and have a look at the Week in Real Estate, which I publish twice a week. And so that covers both New Zealand and global news. And otherwise, if you thought this video was cool, smash that like button, and we'll see you next month. Cheers, bye.